Okay, hi everyone. My name is Paul Burns. I'm the Executive Director of VPIRG, and it's a pleasure to be joined today by Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condos. Jim, thanks so much for being with us here.
You're quite welcome, Paul. These are strange and interesting times we are in.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I asked you to join us to talk a little bit about the state's response to some of these strange and interesting times. The COVID-19 pandemic has tested the state and will continue to test the state in many ways. One of them, of course, has to do with how we run our government at a time when we can't be together. And so that has necessitated some changes that the legislature has taken up, that your office has been involved in, and also some changes to potentially to our elections law and how we hold our elections. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to say, you and I go back a long ways. I've been an advocate and employee with VPIRG for almost 20 years. And a lot of that time, you and I had a chance to work together in the legislature, where you were in the Senate and chairing the Government Operations Committee. So we worked together on things like same-day voter registration and automatic voter registration and allowing 17-year-olds to vote in primaries and a host of other things. And I wanted to just give you a chance to talk a little bit about your philosophy, because I've honestly been impressed over the years about how you have gone to great lengths to try to open up the process to voters and to make sure that the public is involved in the decision-making process of our government. So would you talk a little bit about your approach to these issues?
Sure. So I think this is probably a good time for me to just kind of give a little bit of background, which I think will actually make a lot of my case as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. Prior to being Secretary of State, I served 18 years on a city council, South Burlington City Council. I was the chair of that city council for the last 8 years. During that time, I was also recruited by Governor Howard Dean and then Senate President Pro Tem Peter Shumlin to run for the state Senate, where I was elected in 2000 and started serving in 2001. I was immediately placed, because of my background on government, I was immediately placed in a role of being on the government operations team, which is actually, that committee actually deals with the Secretary of State's office. I eventually became chair of that committee, and you're right, I worked, we were heavily involved in the Help America Vote Act as it was being implemented at the national level in the post-Florida debacle in 2000. We started receiving money here in the state in 2004. And my committee worked with then Secretary of State Deb Markowitz on a lot of initiatives. Some of the things that we put in place at the time, one, we memorialized having paper ballots, and we said that is the right way to go. And at that, if you think back to that time, post Florida, almost a lot of places were actually moving to what's called a DRE, which is the touchscreen technology with no paper backup. And Vermont decided at that time we were going to stick with having paper ballots mandated. We also implemented, as you know, post-election audits after the general election. So we do a post-election audit within 30 days of the general election in November to verify our counts from election day. In that time period, we worked on same-day voter registration, but we couldn't get it through. And eventually, when I became secretary in 2011, I approached the legislature, legislative committees, House and Senate GovOps, and said, hey, look, we need to make some changes to election law to make it more open and accessible to Vermonters. And we need to put a few things in place. So in 2015, we were able to pass, and I know your team was very supportive of same-day voter registration.
Yeah.
with an implementation date of 2017. We deliberately put it after the next general election, which happened to be the 2016 presidential. And that was in 2015. In 2016, we actually added automatic voter registration. And I would say to you, we were, I think, the first state to do it legislatively. Other states had done it, but they hadn't done it legislatively. And I think what I would say about our position and our role in that is that here in Vermont, we had full tripartisan support to bring that to the floor. There were 3 roll call votes, 2 in the House, 1 in the Senate. So there was 1 in the House, then the bill went over to and that was unanimous. So, I mean, literally 100% of those on the floor voted for it. Then it went to the Senate, and they voted 100% with no opposition. When it came back to the House, there was 1 more roll call because the Senate had made some minor changes, which were not problematic, and there was 1 no vote. And that no vote actually had nothing to do with the bill itself. It was the person that voted no was mad at his party's leader, one of his leaders, who was supporting the bill, so he voted against it. But in any case, so we had over 300 votes cast in the legislature and only 1 no vote, and that was unheard of across the country. It has been unfortunately partisan, and it shouldn't be. As you know, automatic voter registration, not only is it more efficient for us, but it's also costs us less to operate, and it costs us less, and we actually have a more accurate voter registration database because we're constantly getting updates to addresses and locations of our registered voters throughout the state. So, and we literally get a upload from the Department of Motor Vehicle on a daily basis. So, so anything that, if you had a transaction with Department of Motor Vehicles, we then get that information that we need automatically. So, and that just makes it a much better situation. And as I tell people, our voter registration database is far more accurate today than it was yesterday. It will continue to be that way every day that goes by.
So Jim, all that to say, you have a long history of working hard in various different positions of making sure that more people can participate in this process. And, you know, at VPIRG, I guess our philosophy is that our government works best when more people participate in it, from voting to, you know, any other kind of participation, coming to meetings and showing up and having your voice heard. And it seems to me you have a similar approach and philosophy, basically.
Absolutely. And I think part of it is I am second generation American. My grandparents, all 4 of them, came from Greece and came to the United States and ended up becoming citizens. I know that, you know, my parents instilled in me that everybody is equal and we should all, you know, and I continued that as we went on. And this is my belief as we go with elections that I oversee now. You know, some little known out there, but this past January, we started, or February, I forget, we've piloted a program with New Americans. Even though we don't reach any threshold legally, we decided that it made sense, and we worked with the New American community, and we have translated into 6 languages the election process and election ballots. Then we piloted it in Burlington and Winooski, and we will continue that for the statewide primary and the general election.
I think that's really important. We had heard from some folks about that being a need that was out there, and I found your office to be pretty responsive, and I appreciate that. I think it's just great, you know, getting more people involved in the process, and it's so important for those for whom English is not their first language, you know, and you want to participate, you need to do something like this. Okay, all that having been said, that's how we got to this place where we are today, and then, you know, wham, here comes COVID-19. all of that we hope to do to increase voter participation and open up the process so that people can participate easily, can attend meetings and so forth, has been kind of thrown on its head a bit here. And so understandably, the government is looking at passing some emergency legislation that would allow the functions of government to continue while protecting both the public and elected officials and staff and so forth. So let's talk about the two key areas that the legislature has been working on this week, and that we expect the governor to sign perhaps as soon as today. This is, we're talking on Friday afternoon, the 27th. Let's look at first the open meetings. Can you describe very briefly what has the law been in terms of open meetings and in terms of allowing the public to be engaged, and then what changes are being given to the governor for his consideration today?
So, and that's a great question, and I guess I would just start with it all emanates from the Constitution, and in in Chapter 1, Article 6. It says that the legislative and executive branches of government, not just state government, but all government, are accountable to the people. Both the open meeting law and public records access law, as you know, refer back to that provision in the Constitution. So that's the premise. And essentially, when it comes to open meeting law, the premise, and to put it simply, the open meeting law allows citizens of Vermont the right to know what its government is doing, the right to participate, to attend, and to participate in what its government is doing. And that's been upheld in several court decisions as well. And it's so, if we operate from that standpoint, and I'm often saying that sunshine is the best disinfectant, that we should all, in government, we should all operate as if there are all 625,000 Vermonters are looking over our shoulder watching what we're doing, because frankly, they should be. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, that's a positive. So the current law essentially says that you will notice your meetings, you will warn an agenda, that you will meet in a place that people know where you're meeting, what time you're meeting, what day you're meeting, so that you can attend. And they have to give you the opportunity to participate in that meeting, not just attend it, but to participate. So if we all would just operate under that scenario, then everything else kind of falls into place. It requires minutes to be filed and posted forever. I mean, essentially those minutes are the history of that town or that board, and therefore those are to be kept in perpetuity. It's really about the public's right to know, and I can't say that enough.
So how do you, in a situation like this where the public cannot attend, where even members of a city council can't attend together, what's the solution?
So we worked with the legislature over the last 2 weeks, actually. We started working with them last week. And what we came up with was, there's a provision already in law that says that that select boards or school boards or other public bodies can meet, if you want to call it by remote access. And whenever you do a remote access conference call, would be a simple way of doing it, or now as we are, Zoom. But there has to be, the current law says that there has to be a physical location where a member of the public who does not have access can go and listen and understand and participate, to be able to hear and be heard at a location, and that the board that is meeting will provide a person to be there to ensure that that system is working. So that was the part that was difficult. So we already had in law an area with a section that said that a board could meet, a quorum could meet to decide business remotely. But the provision about having a physical location with somebody there could create a problem based on our social distancing and other factors that are involved with the coronavirus. So we worked with the legislature and said, okay, we're okay to waive the physical location as long as the public has a way of participating. So eventually, the law that's sitting on the governor's desk right now, and we, as you said, we expect to be signed today, essentially says that as long as it's feasible, there must be a telephone access so someone could call in to listen to it. The other piece of this is that there has to be a way for the public to participate. So if you're using Zoom or whatever, that's okay as long as the public can be heard and also can listen to what's going on. But it also requires for school boards and select boards to actually record those meetings. And it was interesting. I don't know if you were on the call when the House GovOps was taking this up earlier this week, but actually it was last Sunday. But there was a time period where the Legislative Counsel, Tucker Anderson, was presenting the bill and he was on his cell phone from home, and he lost connection. And that basically said to the committee, because at that point they were kind of on the side of it's not necessary to record these. But once that happened to them, they realized, okay, we have to put this provision in. So they did. So
my understanding, Jim, is that this essentially saying there'll be an opportunity for the public to engage and be involved by phone, which is kind of the lowest technology bar, I think that
right.
they were thinking about. Whenever that's feasible, that really does mean whenever it's possible, you've got to allow for the public to join by phone. There may be certain times when the phone line is out or something, and it doesn't. That's really the only time, as I understand it, when you could still move forward. But they really want to try to make, or at least my hope and impression is that they want to make it possible to the greatest degree that somebody could at least join by phone during this kind of emergency period for these remote meetings.
And absolutely. And, I mean, as most Vermonters know, we don't have great cell coverage in this state, or even broadband coverage for that matter. And so that does become problematic. And I think for those that have landlines or cell phones that they do have coverage, they can at least get into the meeting that way and participate. So yeah, I mean, we recognize fully that you don't have, not everybody in the state can be on a Zoom on a laptop or on a PC at home. It's you have to provide, again, the opportunity for the public to participate, to hear and be heard in these meetings.
So I think that's really important. That's something that we certainly pressed for as well, that to ensure that even during this emergency period, that there is, to the absolute greatest degree possible, the opportunity for the public to follow along and to engage. And this brings up another point that we're not going to talk about today, but the need for greater broadband coverage, around the state and so forth. I mean, if there was ever an example, this is certainly going to be it.
Yeah, and I think we've now had 3 governors that have been working on this, and they've all had varying degrees of success. But I think what it's really going to take is a strong effort to literally, put in place a plan that takes off little bites of it every year, rather than a new governor comes in and for the next 6 years we're gonna do this. I think we have to put a plan in place that will start to say, okay, we're going to put a trunk line up into the Northeast Kingdom and then start branching off of that. We're going to work our way into, central Vermont, into the mountains or whatever, and start to branch off of that. And it just brings, I mean, obviously technology is changing so fast these days. there may come a time when we don't need wires, that everything will be, and maybe not even Wi-Fi, it might be satellite. I mean, there already is some satellite technology that's available. So, at some point in time, we're going to have something different.
All right, well, that's not the main topic here, but the other piece of the reform legislation that is on the governor's desk right now has to do with elections. Obviously, critically important. Many of us think 2020 is, in many respects, the most important election of our lifetime, and then we've got primaries coming up even before that in August. So tell us a little bit about what the proposed changes are, if you would, there.
Sure. So what I'll do is I'll break it down into sections. So the first section of the bill on elections actually deals with the waiving of signature gathering for nominating petitions. We started getting calls almost immediately when the governor started to ramp back people and put people on telework, and then started reducing the numbers of groups that could get together. So now we ended up in a position where the governor has essentially issued a stay at home. The governor has said avoid any crowds of over 10. And the last piece was that the governor has said that we must maintain social distancing. Well, and that's for the next few weeks. It coincides with the same time period when people would be out gathering signatures for their nominating petitions. So a House candidate needs to get 50 signatures, usually tries to get 60 to 70. A Senate candidate has to have 100 valid signatures, usually tries to get 125 or 30 or so. And then a statewide candidate has to get 500, and we usually shoot for 600. I think when you start to look at the numbers of signatures overall, it starts to really paint the picture. So here we are, almost all businesses are basically shut down. We've got a stay-at-home order. We are supposed to avoid any crowds over 10. We are supposed to maintain a social distance of at least 6 feet. And it coincides with the same time period. People are trying to get their signatures. You have to literally have a clipboard with pieces of paper on it that you're asking people, you're passing it along and saying, please sign this, here's my pen, and you don't know how many people. Well, we have anywhere from 350 to 400 candidates during a presidential year. So 350 to 400 candidates. And if you just figured, obviously we got 500 on one end and you got 50 on the other, but we estimate that there's somewhere between 40 and 50,000 signatures that will be gathered during this period. 40 to 50,000. And even if we talked about doing it digitally, but then you start to limit who can sign those petitions, because people can't use digital technology for that. So then you start to look at, excuse me, you start to look at maybe we cut the numbers down in half. Okay, so if we cut it from 40 to 50,000, we're still talking about 20 to 25,000 people that we have to make contact with. And one of the things that I've said to the legislature is it only takes one person who's infected to start to pass this thing along. And that's the problem we've got nationwide right now here in the United States. And we need to try to limit that as much as we can. So the committees eventually came around to, okay, for this 1 year, this year only, it's session law, it will only last through this election cycle. We're going to waive the signatures requirement. What that means is that candidates will still have to file a consent form. They'll still have to file their financial disclosure forms. And that's another provision that VPIRG supported years ago. So in any case, those are, we still have certain hoops to go over, but we just don't have that last hoop. And I know there was some opposition from some members of the legislature who said, oh, you're going to have every Tom, Dick, and Harry running for office. Well, you know what? They can now. It's just a matter of getting the signatures. So what's the difference? I mean, we expect we will have more. candidates on the ballot, but we also lowered the submission period. The submission period was a 4-week period between the end of April and the end of May, and we've reduced that to a 2-week submission period, essentially the last 2 weeks of May, for submission of documents to the appropriate offices.
A really helpful explanation on that, you know, maybe it will entice some great candidates to step forward.
Who knows?
You know, so we'll see how that goes. A little more competition maybe heading for the ballot in 2020. Now, speaking of the ballot, the provisions that I think the one that's gotten the most attention, although it may or may not ever happen, of course, would be the idea of voting by mail. There's more and more vote by mail been taking place in the state, but how do you view this provision that would have you potentially working with the governor to decide to have the entire election, as I understand it, possibly become a vote by mail system?
So, and that's a great question, because we can't wait. You know, when we were discussing this with legislative committees, they said, well, why can't we wait and see, you know, if the coronavirus comes back or not? Well, the problem we have is we have an August 11th primary. Ballots have to be created, printed, and delivered to the town clerks so that they have them in their hands by June 19th, because we have our early vote period starts 45 days ahead of time. And that's to meet federal mandates to send ballots overseas to military and overseas patriots of Vermont, of the US. So we have that 45-day mandate. So if you back up from June 19th is the time period. So we don't have a lot of time between now and June 19th to make decisions. So we have to start planning, and there's a lot of logistical work that goes into vote by mail. And then likewise for the November primary, November general election, the November election is on November 11th, and the actual start of the early vote period is September 18th. So again, we don't have a lot of time. And let's just say that the coronavirus emergency declaration goes away as things stabilize sometime this summer. But it rears back its head next fall. And on October 15th, the governor says, okay, we're going into another emergency declaration. That's 2.5 weeks before the election. We don't have time to change our election process at that point. It's too late. So we have to actually literally start planning now in case we decide to use this type of a system. I will tell you there are 5 states, and I know I can remember 4 of them. I can't remember the 5th, but Oregon, Colorado, and Washington were the first states to use vote by mail. Washington, the state of Washington said it took them 5 years of planning to get there. They were the first. It took them 5 years of planning to get there. I will tell you that I think we're all in better shape now than we were then. But I also think Vermont we have had a hybrid system, much like Minnesota and a few of the other states, where we do some vote by mail and we do, walk in at the polling location. So here in Vermont in 2016, 30% of our ballots were cast. 30% of the ballots cast were done early, and I can't break it down to what was done by mail or not, but were done early or vote by using the what we call vote by mail option. It's very easy. You can call your town clerk up and ask to have her send you a ballot. You can go online to the My Voter page that is on our website, which is a unique page for each registered voter. Tells you a lot of facts about your situation, for where you vote, who you vote, you can look at their sample ballot, and you can request an absentee or early vote ballot. Or you can walk into your town clerk's office and request it, although many of the town clerk's offices are now closed. That's another piece of this that we have to look out for. And the other piece is poll workers. probably 80 to 90% of the poll workers that we have in the state of Vermont, and I would bet you across the country, are probably mostly over age 65, which is the high risk group for the coronavirus. So we have a lot of different factors that we're paying attention to as we go.
So you talk about having to make this decision early, much earlier than many people would anticipate, I guess. In practical terms, what does that mean? And as I alluded to, I think there's a process by which you would take the lead, but you would need the consent of the governor as well. It's the two of you, as the legislation is worded, I think, that would agree that this is the path to take. And so, any sense of, what is a timeline that you might be under?
Well, we've already, here in our elections office, we've already started having those discussions as to what we need to do going forward. And when the governor his team had asked us to provide some discussion points, essentially, about the bill that came to his desk, whether we support it or not. We said we did. And part of the reason, Paul, is he wants to be sure. I mean, we've had discussions with him as this bill was being drafted, but we want to be sure that when this bill gets there, that he does sign it. And we also asked his team to provide us a contact liaison so we can begin to have those discussions almost immediately going down the road. Now, I will say to you, as I know you have a young kid at home, the governor's proclamation last night, which he's going to re-up on his press conference probably as we speak, closing schools for the rest of this calendar year, for the rest of this school year, and the kids won't go back until September. That to me says that we may have an issue that we need to address and maybe move forward with vote by mail. I know a lot of the town clerks were concerned, and I have to at this point say also, our town clerks are some of the hardest working municipal officials that we have. On election day, they're in their offices before 5 in the morning, and they don't go home till after midnight. It's going to be, if this is going to work and if it's going to happen, it's going to be because they worked with us on this, and we expect that they will. But we're going to have to do a lot of education, for the public as well as for our clerks as the process might change. And we need to really focus on making sure that every Vermonter that wants to cast a ballot has that opportunity to do so.
So I do think, as you mentioned, a number of the other states that have gone before us here to a vote by mail system have ramped up slowly over a period of time, but we have been taking some of the steps that they would have taken as they prepare for this too. So it's not a foreign idea for people to get a ballot before the election, complete it, and so forth. And we have the earliest, I think, that any state has in terms of the period of time before an election that you can begin to cast your ballot as well. So, so there are some things that we are further ahead, but I don't want to underestimate how much of an educational lift this is going to be. A lot of public education for folks that it's going to be different if this is the path that you and the governor choose to take us down for all good reasons, I guess. But it's going to be a lot of education, and we, I guess I would say for VPIRG's part, would want to be part of that. And I'm sure there are many other civic organizations that would want to be participating and helping to get that word out too.
And we certainly appreciate that. We know we're going to have a lot of partners. We think that the ACLU will be on board with us. We think that other environmental organizations will help us, the League of Women Voters. There will be hopefully a lot of partners to help us. Even some of the chambers will probably help us get that message out to the public, because this really is about the integrity of our elections, and it's about defending our democracy. And I think those are important points that, we want to, it's a constitutional right to be able to cast a ballot. We want everybody to have that right, have that opportunity to cast that ballot. And I mean, our goal is always to try to strive for 100% participation. I don't think there's any state that's even close. I think the highest is Minnesota. They've always been traditionally the number one, and they're around 75%. We were just shy of 70% or somewhere in the mid 60s this past election. Usually goes a few points higher for the for the presidential year. But it's so important that people get out, because, as I've always said, your vote is your voice. That's how you can send your message. And if everybody did, we'd be in much better shape.
Well, thanks for all you're doing and all that your office is doing to protect the rights of Vermonters to participate in the process, whether through the elections or regular meetings of their elected officials. So we appreciate that. And I hope you'll agree to come back, because it sounds like we'll have more to talk about in the days ahead.
That's more than happy to.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Jim Condos, Vermont Secretary of State. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul.
Be well.